Live from the studios of Georgia Public Broadcasting in Atlanta, this is Lawmakers. For March 31st, 2010, the 32nd legislative day of the Georgia General Assembly. Here are your hosts.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Susan Hoffman.
I'm Nwandi Lawson. Coming up tonight on Lawmakers, so-called common sense provisions are added to the zero tolerance law in committee, and an exclusive interview with House Democratic Whip Carolyn Hughley.
But our first story tonight, differences between both chambers and both parties cause budget hang-ups. The governor's proposed hospital provider fee or bed tax is set to come to a Senate vote tomorrow. It is on the Senate rules calendar. The question is, can it pass? Yesterday, we told you Senate Democrats were not going to support the governor's proposed 1.45% hospital provider fee or bed tax. Well, it turns out that some Senate Republicans might not either. Several are running for other offices and have signed a no tax pledge. And depending on how you view this, either a provider fee or a tax, of course, impacts how you vote. What that means is House budget writers cannot move forward with the 2011 budget until the Senate votes on this measure.
My hope is that tomorrow, when the Senate convenes, they'll have House Bill 307 out as a standalone measure. They'll vote on it, get it back over here, and we'll get that done. It's also my understanding on the fee bills, they're going to make a couple little changes on there, which, if they're the ones they discussed with us, we're okay with that, those administratively. And then we get that over early when we return after the spring break.
Yesterday we spoke about this. You really want Senate Democrats on board with the hospital tax so that in an election year, everybody understands that we do this together.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's not an unfair statement, but I think larger than that, this is a huge issue. Medicaid and the rising cost of providing that health care service is not a Republican or Democratic issue. Those are all of our constituents afford themselves of that. And I don't want this to be a Republican solution or a Democratic solution. I think it's important, particularly in the events that are going on nationally around health care, that this General Assembly speak in one voice that this is the best solution to fill a growing hole in the Medicaid budget. And I believe it is. I really believe, as evidenced by the vote on the floor of the House, Democrats and Republicans overwhelmingly believe that. I just hope that message makes it across the hall over here.
You may know that there are two versions of the bill now. House Bill 307, which is the standalone provider fee bill, and HB 1023, the Jobs Act, which has been amended by the Senate to include this hospital provider fee. Both are on the Senate calendar. I'm told by Senate leaders that HB 307 will be called first. Again, that's the standalone. Wisdom tells us if that fails, the Senate will move on to House Bill 1023, the combo bill. If neither passes, budget leaders have to quickly find hundreds of millions of dollars to fill the budget shortfall. Essentially, they're back to square one.
Meanwhile, Senate Democrats are resolutely denying that the Senate Finance Committee combined the Jobs Act with the hospital provider fee yesterday to appease them. Senate Democrat leader Robert Brown says his party opposes the hospital provider fee under any conditions.
We had absolutely nothing to do with taxing on a tax decrease to justify a tax increase on people in hospitals.
Brown scoffs at the idea that the Senate is working to craft a plan that will be palatable for Democrats.
It takes a majority of 29 to pass a tax increase. Republicans have 34 members of the Senate. I do not think that means that Senate Democrats are in a position to stall anything relative to the tax increase.
What is your stance on the potential hospital tax increase?
We think it's unconscionable to place a tax on sick people. A sick tax is not what we need in Georgia.
So how do Senate Democrats propose replacing the potential $700 million that could result from the hospital bed fee coupled with a drawdown of federal funds?
We have consistently advocated improving our collections of sales tax. We've consistently advocated that we not continue to give special exemptions to special interest groups in an effort to balance the budget. We think that it's important for us to remove those special exemptions. It's important for us to improve our collections of sales taxes. We have not advocated a tax increase. Republicans have a majority in both the House and the Senate. They control the governor's office, so they are driving this process. We are trying to see what we can do to improve it, but we don't have the votes to redirect it.
So tomorrow will be the day when the Senate gets to decide the fate of the bed tax. House Bill 307 and House Bill 1023, again, both made it out of Senate rules today and are headed for the Senate floor tomorrow afternoon.
House Education Committee Chair Brooks Coleman defends the state's efforts to draw down federal race-to-the-top education dollars. At the well today, he reminded colleagues out of 40 states plus Washington, D.C., Georgia finished third behind Delaware and Tennessee, and that one of the evaluators noted just how far the state has come in improving education.
The state of Georgia, the evaluator said, has presented a comprehensive, coherent, and compelling reform agenda for K-12 education in the state. They have clearly articulated important, ambitious, and achievable goals that, if implemented effectively and supported long-term, will have a very positive impact on children, educators, schools, and the future workforce and families of Georgia. Not long ago, Georgia was listed near the bottom of the U.S. in the United States in measures of academic achievement and graduation success. Now listen to this, though. He says, since 2002, Georgia's reform efforts have led Georgia to positive increases in student achievement and has moved the state from the bottom quartile to the top quartile of states that are aggressively pursuing reforms to benefit children, families, and long-term economic interests. Ladies and gentlemen, listen to this. We may have been third, but let me tell you, we will be first this spring when the next round is done.
In other news, the House okays only a few bills today. The first, Senate Bill 341, it mandates a minimum 12-month residency requirement for anyone seeking a GED Hope Scholarship. Here's Representative Len Walker to explain the bill.
Senate Bill 341 simply puts into statute a residency requirement for any person who receives a $500 GED grant. These are presently in place. However, there is no statutory language that establishes residency. The consequence of not pursuing this statutory change would be that a person who is a non-resident of Georgia would be eligible to receive the $500 GED grant. It's a very simple and straightforward and very important and needed piece of legislation, and I certainly seek your favorable consideration. Mr. Speaker, if there are no questions, I will yield the well.
That bill, Senate Bill 341, passed easily. The vote was 156-0. It goes to the governor for his signature. Also today, the House passes Senate Bill 319, which seeks to expand the definition of the word textbook to include digital content. Here's Representative Barry Loudermilk.
What Senate Bill 319 does is add flexibility to local school systems so that they may use textbook funds to buy digital content, the hardware that's needed specifically for learning. It would follow the same guidelines as textbooks, but it expands the definition to include the digital content, the hardware and software, so that these textbooks, we can adopt the new technologies that are emerging and that are already available, such as smart boards, as well as the digital readers for textbooks. And that's the context of the bill. Mr. Speaker, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Senate Bill 319 passed easily, but it passed by substitute. That means it must go back to the Senate for approval.
And in the Senate, a vote today to require that pharmacists let patients know when they substitute generic drugs for brand names. Senator Don Thomas explains House Bill 194.
This bill relates to the substitution of generic drugs for brand name drugs and requires the pharmacist to list both names on the prescription. Examples would be like Zocor. The substitute would be Simvastatin, the generic, both names would appear, or as in for pain, Darvon and Propoxyphene would occur for infection. For example, Keflex, Cephalexin would be the brand name. The exceptions to this are for inpatient hospital services and medications, and in specialty packaging for dosage purposes as defined by the board.
And the measure passed by a vote of 46-0. Changes made by the Senate Health and Human Services Committee send HB 194 back to the House. And the Senate gives final passage today to a measure allowing certain disabled persons to work a decade before having to renew their peddler's licenses. Here's Senator Ralph Hudgens on House Bill 128.
Under current Georgia Code, disabled veterans and blind persons engaging in peddling operating businesses and practicing professions, and you see these mostly in courthouses and places like that. They have to be recertified every year. All this bill does is say that once they are certified, then they don't have to go through that recertification process again for 10 years.
The vote of 47-0 marked final passage for House Bill 128. It now requires the governor's signature.
The effort to ban synthetic marijuana, better known as Pep Spice or K2, appears to have a pretty good chance at passage. The House and Senate now have each passed their own version of a bill outlawing Pep Spice, which is said to be 10 times stronger than natural marijuana. In fact, the House passed the House version late on the 30th day, that's crossover day, ahead of many other bills, which means it's got some momentum.
The bills are just a little bit different in the language, but they do the same thing. With both chambers having passed one, it's just a matter of now getting it through, one of them through the other chamber. Shouldn't be an issue getting that done.
Are you getting a nod from the Speaker that this will happen?
I haven't had that conversation with him, but when they both moved through as easily as these two did, and they came in kind of late in the session and moved through very quickly, and when that happens on both sides, it's usually not a problem to get one of the two chambers to pass the other one before day 40.
Representative Neal naturally prefers his version of the bill, mainly because it delineates through the GBI all the chemicals contained in Pep Spice. It's more specific than the Senate version, but he does say that he will take either version in final passage. Also today, Representative Billy Mitchell says it is time to commend Attorney General Thurber Baker for being an independent thinker, an independent Attorney General. You'll recall that Baker's been hit hard in recent days by Republicans because he's decided not to sue the federal government over health care mandates per Governor Perdue's request. So in turn, Representative Mitchell says that he's dropping a resolution in the House tomorrow commending Baker for all he's done during his many years in office.
The Attorney General is an independent agency, and I believe most of the legislators here would agree that we as House members should maintain our independentness, as should the Senate, as should the administration, the governor's office, as should the judiciary. I believe that there are more members who value that independentness than would certainly embrace some partisan resolution.
Are you getting a lot of support or a lot of urging from fellow Democrats on the House side?
I will say that not only am I getting a lot of support from Democrats, but I'm getting support from the other side who seem to believe that us embracing a resolution that would call for the impeachment of a independently elected Attorney General is not something that the state ought to be looking at this time with all the problems that we have.
All right, it's time for another Lawmakers Flashback in honor of our 40th season.
Tonight, we're going to go back to 1998 and a proposal to eliminate parole as it fizzles as the session draws to an end.
Now let's go live to the Capitol, where Susan Hoffman is standing by to update us on these waning moments of the Georgia General Assembly, and I believe she's standing by with Senator David Scott.
That's right, Gerald. Thank you very much. Again, I am live at the Capitol. Senator David Scott is joining me to talk about the parole issue. You'll recall back in December there was a United Democratic Front in which they decided to abolish parole. Unfortunately, they decided they wanted to do it within the first 2 weeks, but have stumbled considerably throughout the session in trying to get this bill through. In general, in theory, do you support abolishing parole?
Yes, I can support it if we're able to wrench out of it the discrimination and the racism factor that is in the application of parole. I don't think the division is so much between black and white Democrats as it is much between Democrats and Republicans.
I've already talked to Senator David Scott. I've also talked to Republican Chuck Clay. Basically, everybody's bantering about that they have ideas of what has to happen with parole. We thought we were going to do this in 2 weeks. We didn't. What's going on?
Well, Susan, we've given even tonight, all along the session, we've given as late as today the Republicans 3 different choices of language on parole. They've turned down each one. We obviously needed their help to allow the people of Georgia to vote on this issue. They have not given on that, and it does not look like right now, unless something happens miraculously in the next few minutes, that we'll get something.
I appreciate your time very much.
Thank you.
That's it from the Capitol right now.
This has been a Lawmakers Flashback.
Save your faux pas. Okay, Sammy, our assignment editor, who's been doing those, totally saved me. I had an on-air faux pas. He took it out. But you know what?
Why don't you share it with us? We can reenact it.
I thought he was going to include it. I was going to laugh very hard.
Of course, if you love these flashbacks, don't forget we're not only going to have them in upcoming shows, we're actually going to have another one tonight. So you'll want to stay tuned for that one.
Back by popular demand.
And not just one, but two flashbacks tonight.
Oh.
And now we continue with our news, and we continue with our leadership. Today, the House Judiciary Non-Civil Committee passed a measure requiring that common sense be allowed in the zero-tolerance policy for weapons in schools. Lawmakers Keosha Jackson is live at the Capitol with the details on Senate Bill 299. Keosha.
Thanks, Nwandi. With recent incidents such as the arrest of Eli Mahone, a student in Morgan County who turned in a knife he had inadvertently brought to school, some legislators feel it's necessary to implement a mechanism that would allow for more discretion in similar cases.
We've seen our share of situations where a zero-tolerance policy has really defied common sense.
Section 3 of this bill changes one word back in Section 3 from shall to may, and the intent of that change is to give a lot more discretion to the judges.
While the committee had no issue with the intent of the bill, there was concern about some of the language included.
In Section 1, what a number of us are struggling with is what is a standing court order? Where my discomfort is there a scenario that we're not thinking of, or that in which we are going to preclude the detention of somebody that is truly dangerous?
After much debate, Section 1 was removed from the bill.
I like the amendments that were made to the bill today. I think there was an effort to strengthen the bill. I don't think there was any effort to try and weaken the bill. Certainly the Section 1 that we changed, that was modified, or some say deleted, has to do with standing court orders. And as a practice, they're not used anymore, and it was heard by testimony from the Superior Court judge. That is no longer a practice. It sunsets at the end of this year anyway.
Now, Senate Bill 299 did pass out of the House Judiciary Non-Civil Committee unanimously and now goes to House Rules. Assuming full passage by sine die, SB 299 will become effective upon the governor's signature. Reporting live, I'm Keosha Howard for Lawmakers.
Thanks so much for that report, Keosha. And now we continue our series of leadership interviews with Representative Carolyn Hughley, the House Democrat whip. I began by asking Representative Hughley why most House Democrats voted in favor of the hospital provider fee, while Senate Democrats reject that tax as a way to close the budget shortfall.
Everybody talks about in tough times we need to sit around the kitchen table as a family and work things out. Well, when the family sits around the kitchen table, everybody participates. And so there's some concern about the fact that we're making this budget on the backs of a minority of our population, those who happen to be sick and hospitals and that kind of thing, as opposed to asking everyone to participate in this difficult time, maybe for a short period of time, and then when things get better, we could go back to a more normalized operation. And so I think that's some of the concern that you see from the senators.
You know, I've heard the House leadership speaking to the fact that they could see some of these economic problems coming down the pipeline, and actually were calling for a special session last year. You all have tried to pass some legislation that would require the governor to call a special session if it looked like revenues were going to be declining in this way. I'm wondering if you're looking towards that in the future as a way to kind of offset future problems.
I think we really need to consider that. As you know, Democrats did call for a special session. We could see from the early indications that we were headed in the wrong direction, but the leadership, the governor and the leadership decided that that's not something that they wanted to do. Of course, you know, the House and the Senate has an opportunity to call for a special session under certain circumstances, but that was never done as well. And so today we find ourselves in a very difficult budget situation and an extended session.
You know, switching gears to some of the legislation that you've been particularly interested in, I know you've been pushing for some anti-bullying measures, and I guess have had some measure of success with some of that legislation.
Yes, we were fortunate to catch a ride on Senate Bill 250, and that was all about school safety. And bullying is a school safety issue, and we were fortunate enough working with Representative Jacobs to get that on that Senate bill, and hopefully the Senate will agree. As you know, the Senate had passed an anti-bullying measure a couple of years ago, but it did not get through the House. So hopefully they will accept that particular legislative piece, and we can make our school environments a more safe place for our children.
And I want to ask you about one other piece of legislation. That is the piece that you had, I think it's HB 1466, which would codify the Martin Luther King Jr. Commission. Tell me a little bit about that bill and what's the importance of that?
We think that's important because Martin Luther King Jr. was such an important person in Georgia history. And right now, we do have a commission, but it's under executive order. And it will depend on who's governor, how they want to handle that. And so we think it rises to the level of being put in our code so that regardless of who's governor now or 10 years from now, we'll have the commission in place and we will have measures in place to celebrate and honor the legacy of one of our most precious citizens.
All right. Well, thank you so very much, Representative Carolyn Hughley.
Thank you.
A bill that would allow Georgians to opt out of the health insurance mandates created by recent federal health care reform passed out of committee today. Lawmakers' Alan Friedman has our story.
The recent passage of the federal health care reform bill, which mandates that individuals purchase health insurance plans, has led to many states fighting to repeal or opt out of the law. In Georgia, Senator Judson Hill has proposed a bill which would make the federal health care law optional in the state of Georgia. He presented the bill to the Health and Human Services Committee today.
I'd like to present to you Senate Bill 317, which basically prevents a government from mandating your participation in government or private health care. Essentially does this, it guarantees that individuals would have the freedom to choose to participate in private health insurance. They'd also have the right to join any government health plan, and if you wanted to exercise your right not to participate, then they couldn't force you to participate or could not fine or penalize you from choosing to exercise those freedoms, those basic freedoms and rights.
A main concern of the opposition is that if the bill became law, it would be challenged and ultimately overturned by the courts, which would cost the state money. I asked Senator Hill if he thought this was likely to happen, and if so, where the state would get the funds to pay for it.
Good questions. The chance that it would be fought out in court is moderate to medium. It's hard to project the future. Where's money coming from? I think the bigger question is where's money come from to pay for the federal legislation? The state of Georgia itself has estimated that it would cost the state taxpayers between $500 million and $1 billion every single year to pay for the mandated federal health care legislation. I ask, where does that money come from? That's a bill that Georgia taxpayers cannot afford to pay.
The bill ended up passing the committee and now heads to the House. Reporting for Lawmakers, I'm Alan Friedman.
Well, because crossover day was such a heavy news day, we didn't have a chance to bring you a flashback. Now, in an effort to get us back on track with 40 flashbacks during our 40 legislative days for our 40 seasons, here's the second part of our double feature.
Also from Sine Die 1998, here is then Senator David Ralston saying goodbye to his Senate colleagues as he leaves to run for Attorney General.
Senator David Ralston is another of those departing the Senate. Ralston is running for the Republican nomination for State Attorney General.
As I think as I leave today, it's not so much what I have done, I think, as what I have learned. I've learned that there's 56 ways to love this state, and they're all special. And I think that's true. And having been raised in a home and in a tradition where we were taught that public service was something that was noble and honorable, I've had that ideal reaffirmed every day I have served in this chamber for all of these years by all of you. But I take from here, I think, some of the deepest friendships that one could ever have, friendships for a lifetime with all of you. And I will have a special thought of each and every one of you as I go on. I just pray for each of you. I guess my parting words would be to keep on keeping on. Keep the faith, know how much I appreciate you, and always, always, always maintain the Senate position.
This has been a Lawmakers Flashback.
Senator Ralston didn't have a successful bid as Attorney General, but obviously things turned out okay. He landed on his feet. Of course, now he serves as the Speaker of the Georgia House.
And of course, the Senate always holds to its position.
Yes.
If you'd like more Lawmakers Flashbacks, keep watching the 40th season of Lawmakers.
In other news, the Georgia Association of Latino elected officials, along with legislators, gathered at the Capitol today in support of making March 31st a national holiday to honor Mexican-American labor leader Cesar Chavez. Senator Nan Orrock and Representative Pedro Marin have both introduced resolutions calling on legislators to support this idea. Lawmakers' Laura Fawaz has more.
We're here today to honor a great hero, Cesar Chavez, and with that great legacy, we will take that here in Georgia and build and work against the injustices that we're seeing today.
I stand here not just because of Dr. King, but also because of Cesar Chavez. Because when he stood up for migrant workers, when he stood up for what was right and just, he stood up for me.
This is not a political statement, but a declaration that we will never forget our past nor accept the indignities of second-class citizenship. Today, we tell a story about unity, prosperity, and opportunity.
I caught up with Mr. Gonzalez to ask what he thought about Senate Bill 67, which would require the Georgia State driving test be given in English only to permanent Georgia residents.
It's a bad message for economic development. It's a bad way for us to attract foreign investment to our state. And I think the governor should step up and demonstrate some strong leadership, as well as Speaker Ralston, to kill this bill and put a stop to this nonsense.
Reporting for Lawmakers, I'm Laura Fawaz.
And now, with news from all around the state, we are joined by Ricky Bevington. What you got today, Ricky?
Lots of news today. Good evening, Nwande, and good evening to you. Mixed is today's reaction from Georgians to President Barack Obama's decision to open vast coastal areas to oil and natural gas drilling. President Obama says offshore oil and natural gas are vital to energy security for the U.S. Tybee Island Mayor Jason Bulterman tells GPB he trusts federal officials to make the right decision. Congressman Jack Kingston and John Barrow have both expressed support for offshore drilling. However, environmentalists describe themselves as sickened and outraged by this decision. They say offshore wind is a better solution. Geologists doubt Georgia has major offshore reserves anyway. Much of it would be close to a protected national marine sanctuary. Savannah is said to get its first black police chief. 60-year-old Willie Lovett is a Savannah native. He's a 36-year veteran of the Coastal Force. He has filled in as interim police chief for the past 7 months since Michael Burkow left top job. Levitt served as Burkow's assistant chief. And a new rail line is a step closer to coming through Macon. The group Georgians for Passenger Rail has a $500,000 commitment, from the Peyton Anderson Foundation, as well as Macon community leaders. The rail line would go from Atlanta to Macon and eventually on to Savannah. There is always more Georgia news at our website. We're at gpb.org, and you can follow us on Twitter at GPB News. I'm Ricky Bevington.
A lot of us get choked up about the rail line.
I'm so emotional about this.
Thanks so much,
Railroad.
Ricky.
And coming up tomorrow on Lawmakers, it is expected to be a very busy day in the Senate. The hospital provider tax, the Jobs Act of 2010, and legislation that would increase class sizes in public schools are all expected to be debated on the Senate floor. Of course, we'll have all the latest from Under the Gold Dome tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. If you've missed any part of this program, please tune in when Lawmakers repeats tomorrow morning at 5:30 a.m. And coming up on GPB, Georgia Travelers Speed Tour of Georgia. That program is next.
Witnesses in the Senate, of course, was heading off for the funeral of their former colleague today. It was a sad day as Nancy Schaefer was funeralized in Toccoa today, but senators will be back in tomorrow, and we will bring you the latest. That is, of course, our program for the 32nd legislative day of the 2010 session of the Georgia General Assembly. I'm Nwande Lawson.
And I'm Susan Hoffman. Please join us tomorrow night for Lawmakers at 7 p.m. only here on GPB. Good night.
Funding for Lawmakers comes from
the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of Georgia's business community, over 4,000 members strong, working with lawmakers for over 90 years to make sure that our state remains a place where companies thrive.
And by supporters of Georgia Public Broadcasting. Thank you.
This has been a production of Georgia Public Broadcasting.